All righty. Believe we're starting to record. Welcome everybody back to another episode of Candid Conversations with your CPA. Today I have with me Bruys Henderson, the VP of Business Development with Urban-Gro. Urban-Gro is one of those kind of exciting, large pubcos made up of architects, engineers, general contractors that has a good amount of experience and skills from outside of the cannabis industry, bringing those, lessons learned into the cannabis industry. And so, Bruges, I'll hand it off to you to kind of introduce yourself and your background. Really like the name, by the way.
No, Raymond, thanks for the invite. I do appreciate talking about these subjects, and also right back at you on the name. I mean, you got a pretty cool name there, man. So anyway, so who am I? So I spent the last 25 years in architecture and construction, and the out of that last 25 years, 12 of that has been focused on CEA specifically. It's on the cannabis side, and then in the last several years, more on the produce side. My background specifically is in architecture and construction. So I had a friend actually in the cannabis industry here in Colorado that kept asking me to come out and help him. And when cannabis went recreational in 12, I said, okay, I'll come out and see what I can do to actually help you with this. Because at that time, I had no clue. Little did I know how much I'd be involved in this industry and what this could mean to me. Architecture always has a up and down side to it. But cannabis, when I started looking at it, actually was more of a recession-proof job. With instead of the ebb and flow process of, what's the next project type, cannabis just became a dedicated focus. So when I started working with him, he was expanding his business and he was having problems with compliance and building codes and general contractors and green taxing. So I started helping him in the process, and we started to find solutions to a lot of simple problems. For me, on the architectural construction side, it was like, well, we just need to do these things, and we can easily solve for that equation. So what would happen is, or as I've learned, it was we had a lot of small circles when I first started. Colorado wasn't that big of a market. There were a lot of
Yeah.
players, but ultimately, uh, it was small circles. So I was able to actually communicate with a lot of other groups, and they had the same problems. So I would lend my services to help them with some of their same issues. And the end result was, after 3 years of working on that, I ended up working on at least 50 projects, if not more, and talking to hundreds of people in the industry. The cool part about that is that as Colorado expanded, or the national market expanded, so did they. They would take their skill sets and move on to different states, and I would just
Yeah.
follow them along as part of the process. So um, when that company sold, I was actually able to transition over to an architectural office, which is actually my focus, and bring in a division that's specifically focused on building projects like this. So we would take those previous connections plus new connections and start expanding on that. And then that led to the last several years of expanding and expanding. So I don't know how many projects I've worked on in total. I've stopped counting because that's those laurels don't really matter. What really matters is what is the current project, and what do clients need help with, right? So,
That makes sense. Yeah.
so, um, we're looking at millions of square feet, over 500 projects easily. I've worked nationally in most states that have some sort of program, and I've actually expanded into international markets. Right now, I'm working on some projects in the Middle East, and we're actually looking at some stuff in um, uh, Africa, as well as we're also doing some exploratory work for, since I can cross over to the produce side, into the Canadian market, because that's their big focus right now. So,
Nice.
um, yeah.
Man, just even like 50 projects, like way back in 2012, like to now, just however many projects you've been a part of,
Mm,
you learn a lot. And it's like, as much as like every facility is slightly different, there's still like the core to these facilities that needs to be in place for them to be like operating efficiently and profitably. So I guess like I probably should have understood this more, but do you build out mainly cultivation facilities, product manufacturing, retail? Like, out of those big three, where do you spend most of your time designing and constructing facilities?
right. So when it comes to those facilities, I would think dispensaries are kind of a secondary byproduct of what needs to happen. So there's not a lot of focus on those. We can do them, and we do a lot of those. But ultimately, the main focus is on the cultivation space and on the labs. We actually have a division at Urban-Gro that specifically focuses on lab design. But we can easily cover the field in both CEA and I'm sorry, cannabis and cannabis extraction. So, yeah.
Nice. That makes sense. So having designed kind of many facilities and many markets, and I think it is cool, like the global side of cannabis, like in America, like we totally forget about that because we can't even ship across state lines, let alone
Right.
shipping to other countries. And then it's like we forget that Canada's federally legal. They ship to Europe all the time.
They
Um,
do. It's kind of.
and so that's kind of like just a funny thing that I feel like we totally overlook. But like I'll be in Spain next month here and in Portugal, and I think it's interesting. And it's, you think it's a small group of cannabis operators in the United States and Canada, like it's much smaller abroad, but still pretty interesting. But on that note, kind of coming back to just the brass tacks, architectures, engineers, general contractors, like given your years of experience, like how do you see cannabis business owner groups, cannabis investors using you guys with, your architects, engineers, contractors during that facility build out as tools to kind of just make the process easier, make the process more efficient and realistically, because like we're just always trying to like get the facility built out on time and within budget. So I guess working with you guys, how do they use you as a tool to do that?
Right. So, the one of the keys to these facilities is controlling the construction cost. And we have found integration of general construction teams earlier in the process actually helps the success of a project, because it really focuses on how to keep that construction cost down. Because if you can't maintain that, then it can make a project infeasible, just because becomes too costly. So you end up back in redesign as part of that process. So,
Right.
right.
Huh.
So yeah, working collaboratively, and integrating the architectural engineering teams early in the process can actually, or the general contractor early in the process with the architect and engineer can actually help kind of keep that under control.
That makes sense too. I have a close friend who owns a residential general contracting business, but also kind of like always has to work with architects and engineers. And I feel like sometimes there's almost like a friction between the two. And so
Mhm.
I think it makes sense that you guys just bring it all in together in house and then work together to minimize the change orders,
Mhm.
work together to get like, because we just want the quotes at the end of the day. It's like from the finance team's perspective, it's like, all right, ownership
Mhm.
group, we're going to build a facility in New Jersey, go get two quotes from people that are able to do the job within the timeline, within this budget, because we have
Mhm.
like a finite amount of capital that we're able to get our hands on. And it's like, I think that'll kind of segue into the feasibility study is like, obviously it makes sense having these people earlier on in the project to control the cost. And I guess like that's the design phase. But once we're into the construction phase, because it does take sometimes many months and many years to get a full facility built out, just understanding how things happen. And so how
Mhm.
do you control some of those costs or change orders like when the construction is taking place over an extended time period?
So one of the keys to that is, by integrating the construction team early in the process, you are looking at it more critically. So you're looking at ways to value engineer along the way. But at the same time, you're also improving the detailing of the project. So when you're like on a retrofit, when you're going through the process of discovering what's going on inside that building, there's always those hidden secrets that you have to tackle. But if you spend time working through those equations and working collaboratively with the designer, the design team, the construction team, and the client's needs, it actually kind of helps streamline that process to shake out some of those change orders or expose those change orders so that there's no surprises later down the line. So typically how we structure it is with a design builder agreement. And that specifically, there's actually language in the AIA agreements. It's a American Institute of Architecture agreements. And there's a cool part about that too, is that normally those agreements are structured, they're non-biased, and they normally focus on the client's interests because they create a series of rules that actually control how an architect is to behave in that process, as well as the consultants. So it's more controlled, as you know, it's more controlled, and the end result is that in that specific contract that we use, the design builder agreement, there's actually a clause in there that says there's only two types of change orders: owner directed changes and discoverables. So if we tear up on a wall, we find mold that we didn't account for originally, that could become a problem, right? And we have to address it in some way. So there might be a valid change order there. But with this type of structure, it eliminates the design bid build process, which is essentially the architect is disconnected from the general contractor. So there's no direct communication to actually work through those scenarios and do those other exercises, those pricing exercises to help value engineer that down and ultimately control those change orders as part of the process.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense. And yeah, I hear you on that. Like a retrofit versus like a ground up build, it's just like, oh, you might find stuff. And like we're always in weird buildings and old industrial yards of these cities. And so it's
Yeah.
like, I don't know, some of these warehouses and buildings have been around for like decades, if not 100 years. And so then we're trying to build a facility within a facility because this is the only green zone in the area where it
Yeah.
makes sense. And so it's like, I don't know, we just do weird things in cannabis that like we wouldn't normally have to do, but that's the game. That's the game we choose to play. On that note, kind of you brought up yeah, kind of the feasibility study. Obviously, we were chatting about that off camera, and that kind of really sparked my interest. Cause again, like we do get calls like that of like either it's like one of two things. They're either a new state where they're, new license holders building their facility from the ground up, or they're an established post-revenue cannabis company that's like profitable and scaling into new markets. And so they're like, all right, we're going to go either into Ohio or New Jersey. So now we got to like think through what's the best market to go into, because you do have options. And it's like that's kind of the beauty of business is like, all right, we're all trying to play this game to maximize shareholder value and profits for ourselves, but like there's an infinite amount of markets to go into and ways to build a facility in that market. So I guess like bringing it full circle on the feasibility study, like how much of that is just purely about the build out of the facility? How much of it is also like the market and the product of what they're trying to do with the facility? So tell us just a little bit about your kind of feasibility studies from the architecture and design side of things and kind of how you think through that with some of these cannabis business owner groups.
Right. One of the things you just said there too about you actually brought up a good point when we're trying to find a location specifically. I do want to focus on that one real quick. When we're trying to find a location, a lot of times you are literally limited on that zone that you could be in. So it's
Oh yeah.
more
Yeah.
likely,
Super
right?
limited.
Right. So you've got like specifically, like, let's just take DC for a second. DC has a very isolated zoning or a very isolated number of buildings that you can actually place a facility in, and it's very difficult to find a place there. And that's, it's because the zoning code is very limited in certain categories for what you can do. So in general, though, when we're looking at each one of these states, we're always trying to find those old industrial buildings that kind of fit into that category. And it's normally your zoning requirements normally end up, if you're focused on a industrial zone, you're normally in good shape. Like anything can pretty much go in an industrial zone. You can literally do trash collection in an industrial zone. But when you get into more specific zones, like manufacturing is still normally kind of like it's still kind of like an industrial zone, but sometimes zoning departments will break it out and call it something slightly different because it's not necessarily industrial, but they are fabricating something there, even though it has a component of industrial um, uh, occupancy. It may not necessarily be the same. And then some other zones that we can possibly put this in is in the like commercial zones, like heavy commercial. It just depends on each jurisdiction at a city or a township, city, county level. All of them have different categories, and all of them have different bureaucratic process for zoning. So it's when we talk specifically, going back to the feasibility part, when we talk specifically about feasibility, it is feasibility can be a broad term for a lot of categories, and it can go from like we sometimes what we'll do is just do a client will come to me with a site and say, what do you think about this? Does this seem to fit what we need? And one of the first things I do is look at what is the zoning for that, because if I can't get past that piece, it doesn't matter. The rest of it is just
Doesn't matter.
So in some cases, you, as part of that feasibility study, you have to actually dig into the ordinances to kind of see what has been passed. Like I was working on one in Minnesota recently, and that one was specific to even though the client found a location that was in a commercial zone, when I started digging into that requirement, it actually said it can only be in an industrial zone, even though there were several different zones that were allowed for like manufacturing and the heavier commercial applications. The industrial was a limitation to that. So anyway, it was still worth the search of that, because if they had made the mistake and signed a lease agreement or decided to purchase that property without that critical piece of information, what are you going to do? You're stuck. You've just committed to a building that may not be applicable to what you're trying to do. So when we do talk, go ahead. Sorry, Ray.
No, that does happen where it's like, because people think there's like, oh, you should know if it's doable. It's like there's some ambiguity in these green zoned areas, and for sure, like I have heard of stories where it's like it's costly delays, even if you're able to, hey, we didn't really know this, we need to get a slightly like either like make an amendment for us, or we don't want to change this. Like nothing's free, and it all costs time. And so like not getting this stuff early, and that's why I always come back to like from finance, it's like, did you need capital, real estate, and a license? And it's like real estate, like people forgot how important it was, because I think now like cannabis is so mainstream, but it's like, because I was out in Colorado 2012 to 2015, and it's like there's still cities in Colorado that do not allow cannabis, and whether it's retail, manufacturing, cultivation, they don't allow anything. And so like you have these weird areas, and for sure you lived through it. It's like green taxing was a thing, and it kind of makes sense too, like from a commercial business perspective. It's like, well, because my dad does industrial chrome, so it's like he can only do industrial chrome because it's a very toxic like liquid that you got to use. And so it's like not every city allows you to do industrial chrome because there's tanks with liquid, and if it seeps into the groundwater, create a whole mess and a lot of things. So he has like a very specific place in Green Bay where they allow industrial chrome to be a thing, so that's where his factory goes. And it's like I experienced the same thing in cannabis, and it was like you can't just, that's what we did. It's like we would just set up a grow wherever you wanted, and you're like, okay, like those can't do that anymore. Now we're going legit. We got to set up grows where we legally can have this facility, because it's like it's going to get inspected. We need to be able to like people be able to come to this. I don't want to go too far back in time, but it is funny, just like where the physical real estate lives is like a feasibility study. And like New Jersey compared to Minnesota, they way more room in Minnesota to go find a place to set up a facility than New Jersey. Because I know like we're going through it with some clients in New Jersey, and like just finding the real estate, like they got the license, they have the capital, and now it's like, shit, I can't find a piece of real estate that fits the business model within like my limited capital needs. And so I guess like past just the actual physical market the facility is located in, how do you guys think through the build out of the facility? And I guess like, do you start with the capital and then back into a facility, or do you have an idea of the square footage and then that will dictate how much capital we need? Like what comes first in this design and architectural phase?
Right. See, this actually plays back into what is a feasibility study too, because
Nice.
when we're working through a design concept. So to answer one of the questions. So when we're actually looking at a project, we look at it from two directions. Like you can look at it from a capex cost and then build into that, or you can go the opposite direction, start design and then work that direction. So it's or you however you want to do it. You can go both directions. You can just start with a design or you can start with CapEx. Either way, you come to the same conclusion. And sometimes it's better to work both ways. And when we're working through a value engineering process, it kind of does that. Because you can start with the design with a general understanding of what you think that cost is going to be. And then as you're doing that, you're value engineering along the way to get closer to that overall cost. But if a client comes to you with a, let's say, they've way underestimated their budget, it's actually better to know that because you can scale to whatever that budget is. But if it does come to the point where they do need to expand their CapEx cost or CapEx or lending position, then we can actually help them understand what that actually is. So, when we're going through the process of the feasibility, I love that term because it actually encapsulates so many other pieces. Typically, when you're working through a design process, it is the feasibility isn't a technical term for what is involved in the actual milestones associated with design. Normally, design is program, conceptual design, schematic design, design development, construction documents. All of that basically means that it's building up to a construction document set that can be permitted. But feasibility kind of lays out across several of those early stage design milestones. And if you want to actually expand it a little further, adding construction costing to that process actually builds to either end of that design process. So you can either build to a construction cost, or you can design in the beginning and then work to or work backwards into the what that design could be. So by integrating construction as part of that process, kind of helps you get to those numbers. But specifically with feasibility, also some of the things that do need to be considered as part of that process is, things that people don't really think about, like a lot of times in cannabis, everybody's got so many tasks that they have to complete that is essentially a checklist. Do I have, I got to build an application, I got to get a license, I got to get a property, I got to get some loans, I got to get the team together to actually design this, I got to do all these things. So everybody's always moving along in segments. As you're doing that, those steps, it distracts from the ultimate goal, and that is, what is this facility going to actually be in the long run? So when we start thinking about those segmented steps, actually interfere with thinking about a long-term goal, and part of that is, where is a cannabis facility going to be in 5 years? Like, not a lot of people think about it that way. And as part of that process, adding some additional thought into what could that be at a 5-year mark or a 10-year mark. Is this location correct for what I'm trying to do in the long run? So it ties back into the feasibility logic of, do I need to actually expand this to incorporate more thinking about what am I going to be in like 5 or 10 years? And this actually plays into, as part of that feasibility process, this actually plays into the services that you provide with stress testing of that model. So when we're actually looking at the pro formas and trying to figure out what's it going to look like in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, your methodology actually helps kind of add some additional value to that path and that logic. It also helps understand, does it make a lot of sense when we're actually going through the designing process and working through the feasibility study and maybe even some construction costing? Does it make sense to over design a facility? And is it better to, instead of building like a Ferrari design, is it easier to build to a Toyota and then maybe work towards something better as part of that? And then does that sync with the pro forma, and does that actually work in the stress test of the process?
Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense, especially like stress testing the building. I think like depending on the license type, like there's normally like a square footage associated with the license in many states. And so like that kind of gives you a ceiling and like, all right, how many plants can we even get into this much square footage? And so then you can kind of back out. But to your point, it kind of needs to happen in parallel. Is like there is a natural ceiling, whether it's based on license or capex, but there is some naturalness. But then there is like, all right, what I've seen is way too many times is people have this whole massive facility design and they've even deployed capital to it. And now they're just stuck trying to raise 8, 16, $24 million. And for sure, some groups can do it and they have the right group and team and the right, licenses and everything in place. But I've also talked to people that it's like, there's no way you're going to raise even $10 million. Like I would start with a much smaller facility. And again, it's like nothing against the operators. It's just like, to be candid, there is different types getting into the cannabis industry. Like some operators, this is their first business. They're in their 20s. Then there's some operators that have been doing cannabis for 2+ decades, and they've done this successfully in multiple markets and built it and scaled it. And now they're repeating it on the East Coast. It's like, well, they have a much better chance of actually like really getting the capital to build out these massive facilities. But I guess like that kind of leads into my next question, where I really liked what you guys were doing is, because you don't shy away from that question. You're like, yes, this facility does cost money, usually in the form of capital raised. I know that you guys, it's not part of what you do, but if you shout out anybody listening, like you guys do make introductions to lenders, then let the business ownership group and the lenders have it out. But I've reviewed your form. I really like kind of just your basic form, because the nature of the cannabis industry being a startup industry, it's like we live and die by like building these facilities, which all require capital. So we call it capital management. And like, it's not just raising it to start a company. Like even once we've been around for a few years, if we want to expand to a new market, it's usually we got to go get some capital to do it. Cause like we don't just have massive cash reserves in these cannabis companies. And so it's like, all right, whether we raise the capital to start or to expand, it's this ongoing thing. We need to manage the capital and have relationships with lenders, sources of capital. So on that note, kind of, you've spoken with a lot of projects. It sounds like you've spoken with way more business ownership groups than projects you've actually done. And so out of the projects that like succeeded and, got the capital, what kind of if you were to think of like a through line, like what gives these cannabis business ownership groups and investors like a high probability of getting that needed capital to build out the facility that they designed?
Yeah, that's
And I know it's a loaded question because
no,
like
no,
not
it's not.
everybody has the answer.
No, it's a great question because it actually ties back into the feasibility logic. So when you were saying
Okay,
before about,
nice.
right? So when you were talking before about, like a team can overextend themselves with the design and, not have the capital build the whole thing out. That means that what that means to me is that one, they didn't really run it through the modeling exercise to actually figure out the construction costing on it, to actually figure out is that project feasible at that level? And, is there another way to do that? So can you work through a phasing process as part of it? But when we're talking about funding specifically, one of the things that we found is historically, there were a lot more VC capitalists or, VC money that was available years ago. And in the last several years, we've seen more of it's still out there and there's still a lot of capital groups that are lending. But the key is they've put up more roadblocks and they've kind of hidden themselves a little better because they don't need to search for these groups. So one of the things we do as a byproduct of what we typically do in the design process is actually try to help teams find capital. And that's not something that we specifically offer at Urban-Gro. It's not like we don't have financial teams here, but we do connect as a byproduct to these other lenders, and they're always looking for viable candidates. And with the feasibility structure, if we've kind of put that together for them, it's early stage design drawings that actually helps get to a construction cost, which actually plugs into their pro forma, which plugs into the lender deck, which is really what the lenders want to see anyway. In the past, right? So in the past, you used to be able to just go to a venture capitalist, say, I've got an idea, I've got this building, I'm ready to go. Can I get some lending? And there was no problem. Now there's a lot more, definitely more steps to it. And right. And the form you're talking about, we actually developed that as part of that process. And it asks, a series of, it asks 10 simple questions, things like, do you have a license? Who's involved in your team? When do you want to start a project? How much money you're looking to borrow as part of it? And
Uses of capital. Saw that
yeah.
was on there. Like, what are you going to use it for? Because you can't just blow all of it on the building. Like, we're still going to need some working capital to grow these plants, make the products, pay some human beings to be at this facility for a number of months. Like, so yeah, what are they going to use it for? Okay. And I'd
It
agree. It's like, it's not 2018 anymore. It's like,
no.
it's a much different game, but that's okay. It's like, yeah, it's harder now, but there's still more opportunity just because like the actual surface area of legal cannabis markets has gone up, even if like the capital has shrank substantially over the last few years. But to your point, and like I come from an auditing and finance background, and like if you think it's regulated in private cannabis companies, like go work for a pubco where you have to get these reports out every month. There's no like not filing these reports, and so and that kind of I think of it as like compliance and due diligence. And so I've always been a stickler with cannabis companies, like trying to raise money without even being able to pass due diligence. It's like you might get capital and get the term sheets, but you're gonna pay a ridiculous amount because it's a lot of risk and it's like it doesn't look clean. And so just getting companies to be able to go through that due diligence process, it's like it does require more upfront when speaking to these people, but it kind of makes sense too, where like what you guys do with that feasibility study and the actual like numbers of the construction, like that totally feeds into the financial model, that feeds into the pitch deck. And so like,
Right.
yeah, it's very
Yeah.
important. I think that is kind of interesting of like having that all dialed in on the front end. It does definitely pay a lot of dividends in the back end. And then, yeah, it's just like, you're not a broker. And I like that where you stay in your lane, Bruce. You're like, dude, we
Yeah.
are construction architects, design, but just the nature of talking to all of you cannabis business owner group and investors, you're all looking for capital because we're in the exact same boat. It's like we have way more business owners that talk to us, and it's like, well, if you don't raise the capital, there's no company to even account for. And so let's just start making introductions to like sources of capital. And to your point, they all exist now and they've raised their hand. They're like, all we do is cannabis. So if you can bring me any deals, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And so, but it is interesting. It's always like towing that line though, like, dude, I'm not your broker. I'm here to get the facility designed and be your CFO. In that process, I can make introductions. And I'm also going to qualify you on the front end. So I'm not just sending you, sending these investors poor, leads. It's like,
Right.
they kind of use us almost to do the dirty work of like qualifying these ownership groups on the front end. So then when we bring them a deal, it's like, all right, like this guy actually has legs or this group.
Yeah.
But
Well,
I don't know. It's still being built for the first time, this cannabis industry. So you just get all types of interesting people outside of like kind of just your experience. Like, and I guess that's once they're introduced, you kind of stay off of it. But I guess like, have you learned anything of like, do a lot of lenders require personal guarantees? Do they require
yeah.
collateral? I know, and that's easier to get collateral when you're post revenue and you have assets. But when you're a pre-revenue company, it's like you kind of have the ownership group's personal assets and the ownership group's personal guarantee, but like that stresses people out. So I guess like, what have you seen as some like requirements from your lenders that, hey, like if you want us to work with you, you got to do X, Y, Z?
Yeah. So as you know, some of those questions, or three of the questions specifically on that form too, are dialed into that specific logic. Like, what is it? What is it you're asking for? And from a lender's perspective, what assets do you have as part of this? What type of secondary income do you have? Are you willing to sign a promissory note as part of this process? Lenders really just want to know how are they going to get their money back, and it's really just the credit. Those are really three critical questions as part of the process. Startup companies, they have a harder time actually being able to apply that because not a lot of startup companies have assets. They're, possibly going to lease as part of their model, which is not, it's not the greatest position when you're talking to a lender because, why are, when they look at it, it's like, well, you want me to loan you millions of dollars and you're going to invest in somebody else's property. How do I get my money back? The asset becomes, specifically if you're investing in a piece of property that somebody can actually, collect if all things go, if you have problems with your operations and it doesn't work out. Specifically when it comes to like startups, those are much harder to work through the lending process. And when you're this actually again ties back to the feasibility. If you have qualified construction bids as part of the process, you can actually sync better with what you're going to need to borrow, and it makes it easier to explain it to a lender, which actually that list that we created actually is more of a filter system to actually figure out what type of lenders actually want to be involved in different clients' positions. So yeah, so that's normally how we do it. And because we don't have lending in house, this actually works as a really simple method for us to filter through the process and see which lenders might be actually interested in the project. And then we make an introduction as part of that process, and then we step away. We don't really want to be involved in those private conversations about their personal financing and things like that. We just want to help the client be successful and find them the money they need to actually get a project off the ground. So
Nice. And I would say that's where we come in, is like, we definitely get personal and like, all right, how do we get this money?
yeah.
Like, what are we going to do? What are you willing to do? What's your risk appetite? What does the wife or the husband say? It's like, it gets pretty real pretty quick. What do the other teammates say? 'Cause there's usually always like a few people on the cap table already, and they're like, I don't like this. And so like getting 3 people on the cap table to agree is hard, let alone when you get to like 5, 8 different sovereign individuals. But on that point, the cannabis industry is going to get built one way or the other.
Yep.
So it's like, you either support it while it gets built for the first time, or just complain about it being too hard. But I would say, like, I was talking to somebody the other day, and it's like, dude, every industry is tough. Like, trust me, if there was this like perfect industry to build commercial buildings for, this perfect industry to offer financial services to, like, everybody would already be serving it. So it's like,
Right.
whether you're in tech or in international construction or cannabis, like, there's always stuff. My founder comes from oil and gas, and it's like, yeah, there's a ton of shit you got to deal with when you're trying to take oil out of the middle of the earth and like drill into the ground. So anyways, I digress, but I like it though. It's like, the nature of the cannabis industry is like, we're all trying to provide value and help people out. And where, like, if you were just serving, like some of your other clients and not in cannabis, like, you probably don't have a whole little lending form set up. But it's like, the nature of the cannabis industry is like, all right, we kind of need a little lending form. We kind of need a short list of lenders and sources of capital that are even willing to work with capital or cannabis. It does help us provide more value as professionals. So I can nerd out on that all day, but let's move forward a little bit just to be respectful of your time. So thinking towards the future, like we were saying it, because we're building this industry for the first time, one time. And it is kind of changes very, very rapidly. And so thinking towards the future, what are you stressed out about? But then also, what are you excited about, Bruges?
Yeah. So actually, perfect segue there. It's actually there's always things that I'm stressed about, or at least concerned about. The funny thing about this industry is that you really do have to have some grit to kind of sustain yourself in it, because there's always something to worry about. It's like you're always waiting for another shoe to drop. So if you didn't have that concern, it would just feel odd. It's always felt, there's always pressure on what we need to do. So things that I'm worried about right now, or things that I'm concerned with right now, are specifically like tariffs and federal cuts. Federal cuts don't impact cannabis directly, but there is actually a correlation, and I'll talk about that in a second. But then there's also the slow markets that are slow to expand. Those are always a concern. And that's just specific for like litigation and things like that, that just are essentially roadblocks to the process. And then the accumulation of debts, since we're talking about lending specifically, there's a lot of debt hanging out there. And I'm sure that everybody has read articles about how many billions of dollars are hanging out there. So, I do have some, I do try to stay on the positive side when I'm looking at CEA in general, because there are a lot of good positions in CEA. It's just sometimes they're hidden with all the chaos and concern, associated with things. So,
For sure.
right. So specifically with, we're talking about tariffs. tariffs actually, we've seen this before. Anytime tariffs come into play, relationships get damaged, and the cost of things go up.
Yeah.
Specifically on the, since we're architects, engineers, contractors, that has a huge impact on the construction cost when you raise a tariff, because you're not an island. You've got to import things, and there's a lot of things we import. From HVAC equipment or components to lighting, to
Oh yeah, yeah.
all kinds
Lighting,
of stuff.
HVAC, siding, just the material to build the damn thing.
Mm.
Okay. Dang. All right. No, that does make sense. And I appreciate you bringing that up because I'm kind of in just in my own little world here, but I haven't thought about that of like, all right, if the tariffs hit, that'll increase construction costs yet again, which will then increase the cost to produce these facilities, which is going to, again, make many of them not feasible because it's like, again, it's like the costs are going up, the prices are
Yep.
coming down. Like, God damn, like this is like getting pressure from both ways here to make these companies profitable. Cause that's all I worry about. It's like, I don't really care about much other than profit. And it's like, profit is, in simplified terms, it's the gap between revenues and expenses. And like price per pound keeps going down. You can only sell so much weed. People still need to consume our products. And so we can't really control the revenues. Yeah, we can have a good brand and try to get premium pricing, but we really can't control the market. But it's like we can control our costs. And so like when costs go up, like we got to make decisions because that's stuff we can control. So now that makes sense that the tariffs should be stressing people out a little bit, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on if you're in the cannabis industry.
Right. This actually, again, this ties back to what we both do, use stress testing and looking at it from an analytical point, us doing the feasibility study and understanding the construction cost, even though there's chaos associated with tariffs and the fluctuation in the pricing. And you got to keep you got to keep your finger on that pulse and understand where that's headed. By integrating a construction team early into the process, you actually can at least keep some visibility on what that could mean for your project. And it actually goes back to, do I need to scale this back? So when we were talking before about like total construction cost or designing which way to go, it actually kind of plays right into that, because if you get to a construction cost and it's out of sync because of tariffs, you can actually back into it on the design side and actually kind of reduce the scale or phase it slightly differently to kind of balance it out a little better. So so right. So when you're so there's ways around it to solve for that chaos. So it's not like, oh my, I can't solve for this, it's just going to hurt my project. No, there's ways to actually, backtrack on that.
And I think that's the name of the game in cannabis, right? Like there's so much course correcting that's happening because these are small startup companies, like we don't just have decades of investors capital and decades of successful cash reserves. It's like, nah, like we have a pretty limited amount of like capital, especially because we're starting out. So it's like we don't have a big cash position. Like our cash position is how much capital we raise. It's like we don't have net income and earnings from years to like lean into. And so being able to pivot quickly where it's like, yeah, to your point, it's the stress test where it's like we kind of think of it as like what's the most highest probability outcome of like sales price and cost to develop. But then there's always this like worst case scenario. It has a low probability, but it still happens some of the times. And so like stress testing these models of like, okay, even if the cost goes up 25% and we have to reduce the size of the facility by 25% to keep it in budget for simple math, can we still make money? And to your point, like the lenders just want their money back. It's like they don't care if you knock it out of the park. They just don't want you to go bankrupt. And so they're like, all right, even if you just like break even for 5 years, pay back the principal and the interest, like that's a win. So to your point, being nimble, and I guess that's where you guys come in is like having somebody, especially on these, like when you're going to deploy capital to build a facility, it's like be pretty integrated with your architects, design, and construction company, because that's ultimately where all the cost is going to be. And that's where we kind of work too. It's like the ownership group, the builders, and then us. And we're like the budget patrol that's always like, all right, by 3 months, we're supposed to be here. By halfway through this, 6 months, we're supposed to be here at direct labor, direct costs. Where are we at? How much more cost do we have to incur? Like doing your construction cost accounting 501c. All my CPA nerds will love that reference. But it's like, yeah, we got to like kind of recognize the cost of this thing against like the budget. But anyways, I digress. And I guess just wrapping up, what it's got you excited about the future though, Bruce?
There is I will say this, one of the things I mentioned was federal cuts. When states actually start cutting their budgets and they have a GDP deficit of, like 5 or 10%, I'm actually hoping that some states will actually start to focus more on cannabis as an outlet for tax generation, right?
Huh,
Right.
I like
So 5 to 10% out of a multi-billion-dollar budget is a significant amount of money, and there's not a lot of things that can make up for that except for raising taxes, right? So, um, I actually have been, reading a few articles and seeing what states. I'm always tracking states to see what might come online sooner than rather than
yeah.
later. And there's more wild card states this year than what I normally would expect. Normally it's only like a handful of them, but this year it seems like there's like 6 or 8 that, might
Well,
come
it's like
in.
the tax revenue is material, it's like any state that comes online, whether it's medical, then for sure, once adult use comes online, like there's just a surplus, a splurge of tax revenue that just literally didn't exist
Yep.
because it was illegal. And then they
Yep.
legalized the industry, and all of a sudden there's hundreds of millions of dollars of tax revenues, which like if you're a rural school somewhere, it's like, all right, this is actually pretty helpful. I know Michigan's going through it right now with like a tough decision, something to do with their roads, and they're trying to take the taxes, but I think that would be interesting, but I could see it played out. Like crazier things have happened where it's like, even if it remains federally illegal, the fact that
Yep.
they're like cutting things and like making it more lean and efficient, they kind
Mhm.
of have to get off of their, they got to make a decision. They're like, well, why am I choosing to not, legalize this whole industry and
Mhm.
overnight 1 to 3 years start sitting on, very material amounts of tax revenues from this newly created industry out of thin air,
Yeah.
like the really don't exist. I live in Wisconsin, so it's like very clear in my mind. Like I live in a legacy state, and it's like, no, dude, we don't have any medical cannabis, no adult use. And so, like, literally within a very short amount of time of Wisconsin legalizing medical and then adult use, there's going to be hundreds of millions of dollars, billion-dollar industry. And so,
Yep.
now it is a glass half full approach to some of the chaos that's happening. I kind of like that.
Yeah.
Um, Anything else that has you excited outside of just like maybe more states coming online, which for sure is inevitable?
One last thing also on that last section, the key to it
Yeah.
is speed, like getting that revenue back in quickly. So instead of when you said 1 to 3 years, I'm actually thinking it needs to happen very, very quickly, like 1 or less than 2 years. So if you're looking at something like that, I mean, we can look at the medical states that currently exist. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of opportunity there. It's like 16 with Nebraska potentially 17 that that could go wreck very quickly and kind of help balance those budgets. So it's,
Right, because they already have a medical program in like 40 plus states. So those medical ones flipping to AU, that could happen to your point within a year. I mean, I'm
yeah.
thinking like flipping it for legally and then building everything out, but like for sure to like get through the legal process if they already have medical, like they should be able to get it on the ballot, get it voted, turn some of these medical facilities into adult use facilities, sell some more adult use licenses to build out, the infrastructure to meet the demand. But okay, nice. No, I like that. And to your point, like the medical ones could happen within a year and some of them
Yep.
might have to, but there is definitely more kind of like talking about it. And like I always just
Yeah.
forget that there's just way more states that have a small medical program that could very quickly flip to adult use. Like I live in this weird state where we don't even have medical cannabis, which is like pretty behind the times, Wisconsin. But most states understand the medicinal value of it. So no, that makes sense. Some of them could flip pretty quick.
You're one of
Um,
the wild cards, by the way. It could be that they have a state deficit and they need to make it up somehow. So they may actually take it more seriously. And it sounds like there's more bipartisan effort this time around. So I don't know. I work with a Wisconsinite, and he's always like, don't get my hopes up on the Wisconsin.
Same here, my man. I remember being in Colorado in like 2012, 2015, being like, man, we got to be like 5 years away. Like Michigan legalized,
uh,
Illinois is about to, and like, man, here we are like
Minnesota
10,
is right
12 years
there.
later. So, anyways, I
Yeah.
digress, but thanks so much for your time, Bruce. Like,
Yeah.
honestly, this was a pleasure. And I think it's one of those things that as more states come online, like Minnesota and Ohio with
Mhm.
their adult use, like the medical footprint isn't big enough. They're going to need to build a lot of these facilities. So, your services are going to be in high demand. And of course, I'm always on the budget side and the capital side. It's like, dude, we got to make this fit. And so like, let's make it work. And so I think I would encourage anybody, whether you're on the business ownership team or on some of these ancillary providers, reach out to you and kind of use you. I guess on that note, what's the easiest way to get a hold of you, Bruges? Where are you most active and where are you going to connect with people?
You can reach out to Urban-Gro. My email is bruys.henderson@urbangro.com, urban-gro.com. Yeah.
Awesome. All righty. Well, I'll have all that information in the show notes, and just thanks again for your time. Be well, Bruges.
Great. Thank you, Raymond.